and let's pick the first question of the day. So the first question goes something like this. It says, identify 5 ethical traits on which one can plot the performance of a civil servant. Justify their inclusion in the matrix. Now see friends, that if we look at this question, you would see that the question has some specific points. And what are they? First, it is asking us for the identification of 5 ethical traits on the basis of which we can determine the performance of a civil servant. Then the question has a second part. It says, justify the inclusion of these 5 ethical traits when you are trying to analyze or you are trying to understand the performance of a civil servant. Now, if you see that from which part of our syllabus this question has emanated, it will not take you time to realize that this question emanates from unit number 6, and some part of it also has overlapping with respect to unit number 3, second part. It means ethics in public administration and foundational values for civil services. These 2 areas are mainly the areas from where this question emanates, but it has more to do with the 6th unit, which is ethics in public administration or administrative ethics. See here friends, that one major mistake that most of the students committed this time was that they got confused between ethical traits and values, and most of them have written down the 5 important values on the basis of which you can judge the performance of a civil servant, whereas the question was asking, identify the 5 ethical traits on the basis of which you can plot the performance of a civil servant. So let's break down this question and let's try to understand that what can be a suitable answer for this question. Now look here, that when we look at this question, there are 2 important words here. First is ethical, and the second word is traits. So the question is asking us to find out 5 ethical traits on the basis of which we can judge the performance of a civil servant. Further, the question says that justify how these 5 traits are enough to determine or to judge the performance of the civil servant, or these 5 traits are the most important traits while you are evaluating the performance of a civil servant. So let's understand the meaning of this term first, ethical traits. Now you know, ethics is a set of norms, principles or standards that any system imposes over itself. So what is ethics? Ethics is nothing but it is a set of norms, principles or standards which any system imposes over itself. So this system could be a political system, and in that context we can talk about political ethics. This could be an administrative system. In that context we can talk about administrative ethics. It could be an economic system where we will talk about economic ethics. It could also be a social system where we would talk about social ethics. So ethics is nothing but a set of principles, standards and norms which any system imposes over itself, and in the light of which 3 things are judged. And what are these 3 things? First, motivation. Second, intention. And third, the action. Now, what are the meanings of these 3 words? See friends, motivation is the drive that is inside you when you plan to do something. It is motivation which drives you towards a certain thing. What is intention? Intention is what is in your mind when you are contemplating an action. जब आप किसी action के बारे में सोचते हैं तो आपके दिमाग में क्या चलता है? That is your intention. Whereas what is action? Action is the actual execution of what you have thought of. So I'm repeating one more time. Look here. Ethics is nothing but it's a set of norms, principles or standards that any system places over itself and in the light of which motivation, intention and actions are judged. Judged as right or wrong, good or bad, desirable or undesirable, permissible or non-permissible. So that is what actually is the meaning of the term ethics. Ethics is nothing but a set of norms, standards, principles which any system imposes over itself and in the light of which motivation, intention, actions are judged from the point of view of right or wrong, good or bad, desirability or undesirability, permissibility or non-permissibility. Do you understand that? That is the meaning of the term ethics. And this word ethical is actually drawn from the root word ethics. Now what is the meaning of this word? Traits. Now traits are not values. Actually traits are qualities or attributes. So traits refer to qualities or attributes or indicators. Now our personality has two types of traits, positive traits and negative traits. The positive traits are the positive aspects of our personality. They are the positive attributes or qualities of our personality. And that's why positive traits are nothing but the virtue that we always talk about. Whereas negative traits are the negative qualities or negative attributes or negative aspects of our personality. And that's why negative traits are equated to vices. Virtues are our positive traits and vices are our negative traits. So देखो एक बार ध्यान से, this question is asking highlight or identify the 5 important ethical traits. It means the 5 important ethical qualities or attributes or indicators on the basis of which we can plot the performance of a civil servant and then justify the inclusion of these traits in the matrix. It means you try to give reasons why these ethical traits are enough to plot the performance of a civil servant. Now friends, you see, I'm repeating it one more time that most of the students, they got confused in the hall and they misread or misinterpreted traits for values. Traits are not values. Values are something which you hold very dear. And you see, UPSC is very smart. And that's why you see, in the next question, UPSC has asked something about values. And there they realized that they have committed a mistake in question number 1. Part A, but you know that by that time it was too late and they could not rectify their mistakes. That's why I always hold, friends, that you have to read the question very diligently and religiously. Pay utmost attention while you are reading the question, because all questions are nothing but an interplay of different types of terminologies and words, and you have to be crystal clear with the meaning of each word that is incorporated into the question. So look here one more time. I'm saying that we are trying to identify the 5 important ethical traits on the basis of which we will judge the performance of a civil servant. Now, in order to judge the performance of a civil servant as right or wrong, good or bad, we need to understand that what are the roles that a civil servant plays. So that's why in this question, unless we identify the role of a civil servant, we will not be able to judge whether the civil servant is performing his or her role correctly or incorrectly. So what are the different roles that a civil servant play? The first important role of any civil servant is the advisory role or the role of an analyst. Now look here, that you know for smooth governance, we need some sort of conjunction and some sort of interaction, positive interaction between the administrative machinery and between the legal apparatus. Or in other words, you see that political executive and permanent executive should work together for delivering justice into the society. And you see that civil servants are the main advisors of ministers. They help the ministers in formulating the policy, programs, projects, etc. So their main role is the advisory role as far as policy formulation is concerned. They not only give advice to the political executive, but they also analyze the existing problems, the existing challenges, and in the light of such analysis, they tender their advice to the political executive. You know, in a democratic setup, the political executive is actually responsible for the formulation of the policy and is responsible to the people in the popular chamber of the legislature. But you know that civil servants are those who work behind the curtains. They work in anonymity. They are the principal advisors to the ministers. That's why the first important role of a civil servant is the advisory role or the role of an analyst. Second important role of a civil servant is the role in which he helps in service delivery. Now you know that under the Indian Constitution, we are trying to build a welfare state, and we cannot build the welfare state unless we deliver socio-economic justice. And socio-economic justice will be delivered only when good and quality public goods and services are delivered to the people. So service delivery, think of the various benefits that flow from different schemes. Like say for example, think of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana or the Ujjwala Yojana. You see, who are actually implementing the scheme? It is the civil servants. That's why you see civil servants' second important role is to actually execute the policy which was framed on the basis of their advice. That's why service delivery is second important role of the civil servants. The third important role of civil servants is civil servants play the role of a negotiator. So they also play negotiating roles, or they play the role of a negotiator. You know that when you work into the civil services, you have to interact with a huge band of stakeholders. It means there are multiple stakeholders with whom a civil servant should be able to engage himself, and then on the basis of negotiations, he should be able to build a consensus around which a possible decision could be made which is acceptable to every stakeholder. So what I'm trying to say, that civil servants, they are always in talks with the superiors, with the subordinates, and with the people. You can also think of NGOs, civil society, developmental organizations, etc. So a civil servant engages with multiple stakeholders. That's why a civil servant should be an efficient negotiator, or the role of a negotiator should be played very properly by a civil servant. And you know that great communication skills can help in the discharge of this role efficiently. So this is the third important role of a civil servant. The fourth important role of a civil servant is the civil servant should be a good manager. You know that civil servants, they have at their disposal huge resources. Also, time management is very important, because if you want to build an efficient bureaucracy, you have to optimally utilize all the resources in your hand, including time. So when we discuss the role of a civil servant as a manager, we are actually trying to analyze that how well he or she manages resources, including time, and whether such resource management helps in the sustainable usage of resources and actually translates into developmental outcomes. So that is the fourth important role of a civil servant. The fifth and the last important role of a civil servant is the civil servant should be a leader. A civil servant should be a visionary. He should not be myopic in his vision. He should always think of the future, and by taking the future problems, challenges in mind, he should design his today's policies or today's, you can say, the steps that he is trying to take must be taken by taking into account that what challenges might surface in the future. Do you get that? So देखो, main role क्या है civil servant का? Main role है advisory role of an analyst, service delivery में role है, negotiation में role है, because civil servants always engage with multiple stakeholders and their idea is to build a consensus so that the implementation of the policy, program, scheme, project, etc. is hassle-free. The civil servant should also be an efficient manager, and civil servant should be a leader. He should be a visionary. He should not be just functioning like a mechanical apparatus in the overall administrative setup. Rather, he should be a living organic entity which gives direction to the entire administration. Do you understand that? तो ये roles है civil servant के. अब इन role के respect में हमारे लिए बहुत आसान हो जाएगा to identify the 5 ethical traits on the basis of which we can plot the performance of a civil servant. So let's now plot these 5 ethical traits. The first trait that is required in a civil servant is that how open he is, or openness to new ideas or learning, plus the desirability to help the weak and vulnerable. This is the first important criteria, or this is the first important attribute, ethical attribute, on the basis of which we can judge the performance of a civil servant. देखो क्या है? सबसे पहले we have to see that whether the civil servant is rigid or flexible in mind, whether he is welcoming new ideas, new approaches, whether he is eager to learn, and whether he upholds the value of objectivity, because only when he has objective thinking process and he learns things on the basis of facts, experimentation and rational logic, then you would see that the civil servant would be a liberal minded civil servant. A liberal minded civil servant is one who is open to new ideas, who is not rigid, who is more flexible in approach. And how much is his desirability to help the weak and vulnerable? Well, this will directly flow from an important value, and that is dedication to public services. When the civil servant would be dedicated to public services, you would see that he would be driven by an urge to help the people, especially the weak and vulnerable section. Because you see that the weak and vulnerable sections, they are more dependent on the quality of public goods and services. अगर public goods and services उनकी quality अच्छी होती है तो सबसे ज़्यादा benefit जो होता है वो weak and vulnerable sections को होता है, especially those sections who cannot afford those services or goods in the open competitive market. That's why you see that a welfare state is designed where the civil servants will play a pivotal role in the service delivery. So that's the first attribute on the basis of which we would see that whether the civil servant is actually performing well or not. The second attribute is the understanding of the problem. Whether the civil servant has a deep understanding of the problem at hand, or he has only a superficial understanding of the problem at hand. Like say for example, if one area is suffering from water scarcity, then whether the civil servant understands the real reasons that feed into that problem, or he has only a superficial understanding of why water is scarce in the region. Suppose he just make a direct correlation with the lack of rainfall. if suppose the civil servant understand that it is not only the lack of rainfall, or you can say the unreliable precipitational pattern, but also the unsustainable usage of water, the creation of wastewater, the lack of recycling, etc., are the reasons for the non-availability of water in the region, then we would say that the civil servant has a deep understanding of the issue. So the second important attribute or the ethical trait should be how deeply the civil servant actually understands the problem of the public. And you know that this is directly related to the desirability of helping the people. When the civil servant would be motivated to help the poor, he would definitely understand or try to understand the problem in great depth. That's the second ethical trait. The third ethical trait is ability to engage. Ability to engage with multiple stakeholders. Because if a civil servant cannot engage himself or herself with multiple stakeholders, then he would not be able to build a consensus around a particular issue. Suppose एक ब्रिज बनने वाली है जिसके लिए कुछ फॉरेस्ट पैच क्लियर करना है, but suppose the civil servant does not talk with the environmental activists or the tribal people who were inhabiting that forest, then you can understand that he may face some resistance while he is in the process of implementation of the project, the bridge project in this context. Do you understand that? So the ability to engage actually helps the civil servant in working in networks. These networks could be social networks. These networks could be administrative networks. These networks could be economic networks. Think of a public-private partnership program. Think of the ability of the civil servant to negotiate or to engage in that situation. You know, a civil servant who would engage himself or negotiate very properly will more often than not come to that conclusion where you would see that there is a consensus around the implementation or execution of any particular project, program, scheme, policy, etc. So that's the fourth important ethical attribute कि हमको देखना पड़ेगा कि ये civil servant कैसा है. Does he engages himself very well with the different stakeholders, or his negotiating skills are not so good? Do you understand that? Then the fourth quality or the fourth attribute that we are looking for when we are evaluating the performance of the civil servant is how good is he with respect to strategic management. Strategic management, and how much is his commercial awareness. Now, what is strategic management? Strategic management, friends, is nothing but management of resources in hand and the management of time. You know that if suppose a civil servant is working very diligently, working very hard, giving his heart and soul to administration, yet he is not honoring deadlines, he is not honoring the time limit which has been set for a particular task, then you would not call such a civil servant as an efficient civil servant. Though that civil servant could be a man of integrity, but he would definitely lack efficiency in this context. Do you understand that? So strategic management simply means that how civil servants manage resources, including monetary resources, because you know that ultimately in order to ensure the success of any program, policy, scheme, etc., what is the required is funds. If we lack funds, we will not be able to execute the program, policy, project, etc. successfully. That's why how well a civil servant manages the resources. These resources could be monetary resources, human resources, physical resources, any other kind of resources. All the kinds of assets that administration has at its disposal. उन सारे assets को कैसे use करता है एक civil servant? उसके basis पे हम decide करेंगे whether the civil servant is performing well or not. And strategic management also includes management of time. How well a particular civil servant is managing time. Because you know, friends, that if we do not take time into consideration, then with the best of intentions also, we may fail to deliver what is actually expected out of us. Do you understand that? Same is true with administration as well. People have this general expectation that good quality public services and public goods would be delivered by the bureaucracy and on time. Do you understand that? So how much a particular civil servant is actually honoring the time limits or the deadlines, that would be an important criteria to judge whether the civil servant is performing well or he is performing poorly. Commercial awareness simply means that you know that in modern liberal capitalist open arrangements, it is profit which often ensures sustainability to any operation. If you are not making profit, at least you should not make losses. Otherwise, the sustainability of the operation would be hampered. Today, you see that government offices, they outsource large number of tasks. They do not do all the tasks on their own. Rather, they outsource those tasks to business processing units. And these business processing units, therefore, go into contracts with the government. The civil servant is the primary entity through which these contracts are actually executed. Now look here, that if a civil servant understands the commercial needs of his department, suppose a civil servant who is working in the agricultural department understands that from where the revenues are generated for the agricultural department and what are the expenditure outlets of the agricultural department, and on the basis of that only he takes steps or contemplates action. Now, if a civil servant does not take into consideration the revenues but only bothers himself with expenditure, after some time you know that the funds would be empty and the civil servant, notwithstanding the best of his intention, will be in no position to deliver anything to the people. That's why you see that commercial awareness is an important attribute on the basis of which we can judge the work of a civil servant. And the final attribute that we can consider here in the context of this question is the ability of a civil servant to make decision, or the decision making capability of a civil servant, especially in crisis situation. Now think of an IPS officer, how he would respond when there is a terrorist attack or there is a communal riot. How well he has responded or she has responded to this chaotic crisis situation would determine how well he or she has performed. Do you understand that? Decision making capability is directly associated with some important values like creativity or creative thinking, innovative approach. So how innovative the civil servant was while dealing with the crisis. Suppose there is a disaster kind of situation, suppose there is a pandemic kind of situation, how well the civil servant or how well a particular civil servant has managed the situation, or how well he has taken decisions under such crisis situation. This reflects the balance of mind of the civil servant. Do you understand that? And don't you think, friends, that balance of mind should be an important criteria while judging the performance of any entity? And why not in the case of civil servants then? Therefore, you see that openness to new ideas, this is drawn from the underlying value of objectivity. Desirability to help the weak and vulnerable, this is drawn from the underlying value of dedication to public services. Understanding of the problem, ability to engage with multiple stakeholders, work in collaborative networks, ability to build consensus through negotiations, the strategic management of resources, physical, monetary, and time, commercial awareness, awareness of sustainability of the operations of particular enterprise, be it the public enterprise. Do you understand that? Whether this thing, what we are contemplating for now, is going to sustain itself in future or not, or whether it would nosedive into the future. the civil servant should be a visionary. Remember, the civil servant should play the role of a leader as well. So he should be a visionary. He should understand what might happen in the future. Do you get that? And finally, the ability to take decisions. Decisions which include creativity, innovative approach, etc., especially during crisis situations. And you see that all these attributes could now be justified in the light of the role of a civil servant. Do you understand that, friends? So you see that this is what was the actual demand for the question. So I'm repeating it one more time before I open the floor for your questions. Please keep your questions, stick to this question only. If you have general questions, I will give you the opportunity to ask those general questions at the end of this session. So look here, the question was identify 5 ethical traits on the basis of which we can plot the performance of a civil servant and justify the inclusion of these traits in the matrix. Now you see, what is ethics? Ethics is nothing but it is a set of standards, norms and principles which any system places over itself, in the light of which motivation, intention and actions are judged as good or bad, right or wrong, desirable or undesirable, permissible or non-permissible. Traits are qualities, attributes or indicators. Now, what is the role of a civil servant? The civil servant plays 5 primary roles: advisory role and the role of an analyst, service delivery role, the role of a negotiator, the role of a manager and leadership roles. These are the 5 primary roles that any civil servant plays. And what are the 5 ethical attributes now? They must be seen in the light of these roles, the roles that are expected out of a civil servant. So what are the attributes? Openness to new ideas and openness to learning. Desirability to help the poor people, the weak and the vulnerable. Now you see that civil servant should uphold the public trust. Civil servant should always help in the efficient and timely delivery of public services. But the civil servant should always pay more attention towards the weak and vulnerable sections of the population, because they are in more need of the goodwill of the administration. Second, the understanding of the problems, whether the civil servant has a superficial understanding or an in-depth understanding of the particular problem. ये तो बिल्कुल ध्यान में रखना चाहिए in order to understand that whether the civil servant has performed well or he has performed badly. The ability to engage, it means how good the civil servant is playing the role of a negotiator. Strategic management, management of time, resources, money, and commercial awareness. It means whether the civil servant is aware about the sustainability operations. And finally, the ability to take decisions during crisis situation. So this was question number 1, part A. So now, friends, you can ask your questions as far as this question was concerned. Okay, so I have a question. It says, as a civil servant, what should be the priority, the rule book or the code of conduct decided for bureaucrats, or compassion we learn from our childhood? Excellent question. This question has been asked by Devita. Now, look here. This is a popular debate. In fact, it is one of the most important debates in administrative circles, that whether we should follow the administrative code of conduct, code of ethics, or we should take decisions on the basis of our own understanding of right and wrong. We'll see, friends, that we have to adopt a mix of both. We cannot say that we will only go by the book. Yes, we should not violate the basic tenets of the book. We should not violate the basic attributes, the basic guidelines, the basic directions of the rule book. But at the same time, we should not give up our basic human values or foundational values of civil services like integrity, compassion, empathy, objectivity, impartiality, non-partisanship. We should not give up these values. So we must adopt a mix of both. And this we can attain through persuasion, through feedback loops, and through negotiation. So that is what I would advise, that we should not go for any extreme. And if we look at Buddha's Madhyam Marga or we look at Aristotelian golden meal, that is what they are suggesting. Mohit has asked a question. Sir, please tell how to choose questions to write in exam to start the paper when it seems I can write something about everything, and even after writing every question I get poor marks in the test. See Mohit, this is again a very general question, so I will entertain those questions at the end of the session. Okay, so SR has asked one question. Sir, if we have to choose between the efficient administrator but corrupt and inefficient administrator but honest, then what should be the approach of selection and priorities? Well, you see that an intelligent administrator who is inherently corrupt is always more dangerous. Why? Because he will use all his intelligence to subvert the system. That's why it is good to choose a person who is ethically sound but may not be so much intelligent, because you see that through proper training processes and systems, skills can be developed, but it would take a greater effort to change the moral makeup of the person. That's why if you have to choose between attitude and aptitude, always go for attitude, because if someone has the right attitude, you can inject the appropriate skills that is necessary. Maybe he will not be performing at the best expected levels, but definitely he would not be subverting the system. He would not be engaging himself into any surreptitious attempt to subvert or destroy the system. He would be contributing towards nation building, though not at that level which is actually desirable. But you know that there is always room for improvement. But a person who is intelligent and is corrupt is a dangerous person. You see that only knowledge and no ethics makes man a clever devil. So that person will destroy the system from within like a termite, and the entire administrative machinery will collapse, and the people will lose all the trust in the administration. Clear? So next question, Lipu has asked, sir, question number 1A can be started with a story. Yes, you can start this question with a story, but my advice would be to keep it very short, not going beyond 30 or 35 words, because if you use more space for the story, then you would be fighting for both space and time going forward in the answer. Do you understand that?